The egg had been wrong from the start. Every elder in the Creche of Vales knew it. Every scalekeeper, every flame tender, every ancient worm who had watched 1,000 clutches hatch and harden and take to the skis, they all looked at that single egg resting in the warmth of the geothermal vents and felt something cold settle in the pit of their stomachs. It was too small. Not dangerously so, not the kind of small that spoke of sickness or weakness in the shell, but small in a way that felt deliberate, as though whatever was growing inside had decided, very carefully, to take up less space than it should have. The shell was a thing of impossible beauty, deep obsidian black shot through with veins of molten gold that pulsed faintly with a rhythm that wasn't quite a heartbeat and wasn't quite magic but something caught between the two. It looked like a fragment of a dying star had been wrapped in silk and left in the care of the earth. No one had ever seen an egg like it, and no one knew where it had come from. The Creche of Vales was not a place that welcomed outsiders. Carved into the belly of Mount Sereth, deep within the range that the humans of the lowland valleys called the spine of the world, it was the sacred nursery of the dragonkind, the last remaining stronghold where eggs were laid, incubated, and hatched under the watchful eyes of the elder matriarchs. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that fell upward, defying gravity through ancient ward magic so old that even the eldest dragons could not remember who had woven it. The tunnels inside were lined with heat crystals that glowed in soft amber and deep crimson, maintaining a constant temperature that varied from chamber to chamber depending on the needs of each clutch. There were 17 clutches incubating when the egg appeared. 17 clutches, 412 eggs in total, each one catalogued and tracked and tended with the meticulous devotion that dragonkind reserved for only one thing, the continuation of their species. For dragons were not numerous. They had not been numerous for a very long time. The wars with the human empires of centuries past, the plagues that had swept through the valleys and climbed into the mountains, the slow encroachment of cold winters and shorter summers, all of it had chipped away at their numbers until the species hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. Every egg mattered, every hatchling was a prayer for the future. So when Matriarch Valeth discovered the strange egg resting in the warmest chamber, the heart cavern, where only the eggs of the high blood were placed, she did not scream. Dragons did not scream. But she did something that was, in its own way, far more alarming. She went completely still. For a creature made of fire and scale and ancient power, stillness was the most unsettling thing a dragon could express. Valeth was old. Older than the human kingdoms to the south, older than the stone bridges that spanned the great rivers, older perhaps than the mountain itself. Her scales had faded from the brilliant crimson of her youth to a deep burnished copper that caught the light of the heat crystals and held it like molten metal. One of her eyes was clouded with age, the iris a pale amber that saw more through magic than through sight. The other was sharp and clear and black as a pit, and it was this eye that she fixed upon the egg with an intensity that made the air around her shimmer. "How?" she whispered. The word carried no echo. The heart cavern absorbed sound the way dark water absorbed light, and Valeth's whisper simply vanished into the stone as though it had never existed. But the two scale keepers who accompanied her, a young pair named Kithra and Toran, both barely a century old, both still carrying the bright green scales of adolescence, heard it clearly. Kithra leaned forward, her elongated neck curving with the fluid grace that all dragons possessed but few truly mastered. "Matriarch, should I?" "Touch nothing," Valeth commanded. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Kithra's snout stopped an inch from the egg's surface and did not move again. Valeth circled the egg slowly. 3 full circuits, her massive claws clicking against the stone floor with a sound like distant thunder, each step measured and deliberate. The gold veins in the shell pulsed as she passed, and Valeth was certain, absolutely certain, that the poolsing was responding to her presence. Not random, not the passive glow of residual magic. Active, aware. "It is not ours," she said at last. Toran shifted his weight, his tail curling anxiously around one of the heat crystal pillars. "Not ours, but the shell, the coloring, I've never seen anything like." "You have never seen anything like it because nothing like it has ever existed among dragonkind." Valeth settled onto her haunches, tucking her forelegs beneath her chest with a precision that belied her age. "This egg is not dragon-made. The magic is wrong. The structure is wrong." She paused, and for a moment something that might have been wonder passed across her ancient features. "The beauty of it is wrong. We do not make things this beautiful. We make things that are powerful, things that endure. Beauty is a byproduct, never the purpose. This egg was made to be beautiful, deliberately." "Then who?" "I do not know." The admission cost Valeth something. She was a matriarch. She had led the creche through famine, through the loss of 3 clutches to a cave-in, through the terrible season when the heat crystals had begun to dim and every dragon in the mountain had feared that the end had finally come. She was supposed to know things. She was supposed to have answers. But she looked at this egg, this impossible, exquisite, terrifying egg, and she had nothing. "Remove it," she said. Kithra's head came up sharply. "Remove it, matriarch. If it's not dragon, then what is it? What if it's dangerous? Should we not study it? Or if I wanted it studied, I would have said so. I said remove it. Take it to the outer caverns and place it in one of the abandoned nests. I will not have an unknown thing sitting among our eggs like a wolf among lambs." Kithra and Toron exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that young dragons exchanged when they disagreed with an elder but knew better than to say so. They were both thinking the same thing, that the egg was small and alone, and that abandoning it in the cold reaches of the outer caverns was as good as a death sentence. But Valith was matriarch, and her word was law carved in stone and sealed in fire. Toron carefully scooped the egg up in his jaws, holding it with a gentleness that belied the rows of serrated teeth that framed it, and carried it out of the heart cavern. Kithra followed close behind, her tail twitching with agitation. They placed it in a shallow depression in the floor of the outer caverns, a nest that hadn't been used in decades, its stone worn smooth by the bodies of hatchlings long since grown and gone. The temperature here was cooler, the heat crystals sparse and dim, not cold enough to kill but cold enough to slow, to delay. Kithra looked down at the egg one last time. The gold veins pulsed, and she could have absolutely sworn that the pulsing was slower now, fainter, like a heartbeat losing its rhythm. She turned away and did not look back. But that night, when her duties were done and the creche was quiet and the only sound was the distant rumble of the waterfall that fell upward at the mountain's entrance, Kithra returned. She brought a heat crystal from one of the warmer tunnels, not one that would be missed, and placed it beside the egg. She told herself it was because if the egg hatched and whatever was inside died of cold, there would be questions, and she did not want to answer those questions. She did not admit, even to herself, that the egg's beauty had touched something in her that she did not have a name for. It hatched 3 weeks later. Kithra was the first to know. She had been checking on the egg every night, a habit that had become ritual, then compulsion, then something she no longer tried to justify. And when she slid through the narrow tunnel into the outer caverns that evening, she heard a sound that stopped her in her tracks. A cracking. Not the sharp, decisive crack of a dragon egg splitting along its fault lines. Dragon eggs hatched with violence and noise and the kind of dramatic flair that the species considered appropriate for the arrival of a new life. This was different. This was a soft, almost hesitant sound, the kind of sound a creature makes when it is breaking something but doesn't want to be caught doing it. Kithra crept forward, her belly low to the ground, and peered over the edge of the abandoned nest. The shell was splitting. The obsidian surface was fracturing along the gold veins, the cracks spreading outward from a point near the top of the egg like the branches of a tree. And through the cracks, Kithra could see light, not the warm amber of the heat crystal she had placed beside the nest, but something else entirely. Something silver. Something that moved like liquid and glowed like moonlight trapped in water. She held her breath. A piece of shell fell away. Then another. Then the entire top of the egg simply dissolved, not broke, not cracked, but dissolved into a fine black dust that swirled in the air for a moment before settling on the stone like dark snow. And what was left sitting in the ruins of the shell was the most beautiful thing Kithra had ever seen. The hatchling was small. Smaller than any dragon hatchling had a right to be, barely the size of a large house cat, its body slender and delicate in a way that made Kithra instinctively want to curl around it and shield it from the world. Its scales were not the muted greens and browns and reds of typical dragon hatchlings. They were iridescent, every scale shifting between colors as it moved, catching even the dim light of the heat crystal and refracting it into a dozen different shades. Silver and pearl and pale gold, with hints of rose and lavender, and a deep, impossible blue that Kithra had only ever seen in the heart of glaciers. Its wings were translucent, veined with faint lines of gold that matched the veins of the eggshell. Its eyes were enormous, too large for its face, giving it an expression of perpetual, wide-eyed wonder, and they were the color of molten silver, bright and liquid, and filled with something that Kithra could only describe as fear. The hatchling was shaking. Not the vigorous trembling of a newborn dragon trying to dry its scales and orient itself to the world. This was a fine, controlled shaking, the kind of shaking that came from a creature that was terrified and trying very hard not to show it. "Hello," Kithra said softly. The hatchling flinched so hard that it nearly toppled out of the nest. Its tiny wings snapped open. They were absurdly large for its body, like a butterfly's wings on a mouse, and it scrambled backward, pressing itself against the far wall of the nest with a desperate, panicked energy that made Kithra's heart clench. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, keeping her voice as gentle as she could. Dragon voices were not built for gentleness. They were built for roaring across mountain ranges and issuing commands that could be heard through solid stone. But Kithra tried. She tried very hard. The hatchling stared at her. Its silver eyes were so wide that the pupil was barely visible, just a thin slit of darkness surrounded by all that luminous silver. Its mouth opened slightly, and Kithra could see that even its teeth were different. Small, fine, almost delicate, not the serrated fangs of a dragon but something closer to she didn't know what. "It's all right," Kithra said. She lowered her head slowly, bringing her eye level with the hatchling and held completely still. "You're safe here." The hatchling did not look like it believed her. It stayed pressed against the wall of the nest for the better part of an hour, shaking, watching Kithra with those enormous silver eyes. Kithra stayed where she was, patient, unmoving, barely breathing. She had helped tend hatchlings before. She knew that the first hours after hatching were critical, the newborn's imprinting period, when it formed its first associations and first bonds. If a hatchling's first experience was fear, that fear could shape its entire personality, its entire life. She would not be this creature's first fear. Eventually, slowly, so slowly that Kithra almost missed it, the hatchling uncurled. Its wings folded back against its body, and its shaking diminished from a constant tremor to an occasional shiver. It looked at Kithra for a long time, its head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that was so utterly unlike dragon behavior that Kithra felt a chill run down her spine. Then it made a sound. Not a hiss, not a growl, not the piercing cry that dragon hatchlings used to announce their presence to the world. It was a soft, warbling note, musical, almost like the sound a wind chime makes when a very gentle breeze passes through it. It was a sound that carried no aggression, no demand, no threat. It was a question, if Kithra had ever heard one. A question asked by something that had never known a voice, and had just discovered it had one. Kithra's eyes burned, she did not know why. She answered with the softest rumble she could produce, a sound so low that it was more vibration than noise, a greeting that dragon mothers used to soothe their eggs before hatching. The hatchling's ears, and they were actual ears, not the armored ridges that dragons had, but soft, pointed ears that flattened and swiveled like a cat's, twitched at the sound. Its head tilted further to one side. Then, with the cautious deliberation of a creature approaching something that might either save its life or end it, the hatchling took a single step toward Kithra. Just one. Kithra did not move. The hatchling stopped, waited, took another step. And another. And another, each one slower than the last, until it was close enough that Kithra could feel the warmth radiating from its tiny body. A different kind of warmth than dragon fire, softer, more diffuse, like the warmth of sunlight on skin rather than the heat of a forge. The hatchling stretched out its neck, absurdly long and slender like a swan's, and very gently touched its snout to Kithra's scales. The contact lasted less than a second. Then the hatchling jerked back as though it had touched something hot and retreated to the far side of the nest again, where it sat down heavily and began to shake once more. But Kithra had felt what passed between them in that brief moment of contact. A flash of something, not words, not images, but emotions. Raw, undiluted, overwhelming in their intensity. Fear, loneliness, confusion, a desperate, aching need for safety. And beneath all of it, like a single candle flame in a dark room, a tiny, fragile spark of hope. Kithra closed her eyes and let out a breath that she felt like she had been holding for a very long time. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said quietly, "and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as you need." The hatchling said nothing, but its shaking slowly, gradually began to ease. Kithra kept her word. She came every night. Sometimes she brought food, small prey animals, stunned but alive because she didn't know what the hatchling ate and wanted to offer options. The hatchling refused everything for the first 3 days, and Kithra began to worry that it would starve. But on the 4th night she brought a bowl of mountain spring water that she had warmed with her breath, and the hatchling lapped at it so eagerly that it splashed water across Kithra's snout. She laughed, she couldn't help it. The sound was surprised out of her, a rough, rumbling chuckle that was entirely undignified for a dragon of any age, and the hatchling, startled, tripped over its own feet and tumbled into the bowl of water. It emerged dripping and indignant, its iridescent scales plastered to its tiny body in a way that made it look even smaller than it already was. It sneezed, a delicate chiming sneeze that sent a tiny spray of water droplets into the air, each one catching the light of the heat crystal and flashing like a microcosm of the aurora, and shook itself vigorously. Kithra laughed again, harder this time, and the hatchling fixed her with a look of such profound offense that she had to press her muzzle to the ground to keep from shrieking with laughter. After that, things changed. Not quickly, not dramatically. The hatchling did not suddenly become bold or friendly or comfortable. It still flinched at sudden movements. It still pressed itself against the wall of the nest when Kithra arrived, as though it needed to remind itself that she was not a threat. It still refused to eat solid food, existing on water and whatever mysterious energy the gold veins in its scales seemed to produce. But it began to watch Kithra with something other than fear. Curiosity, perhaps. or the cautious interest of a creature that was slowly, painfully, allowing itself to believe that it might not be alone in the world. On the 10th night, the hatchling made a sound that Kithra had not heard before, a low, soft hum that rose and fell in a pattern that was almost but not quite melodic. It hummed for several minutes, its silver eyes half closed, and Kithra realized with a start that it was the hatchling's version of purring. She very carefully, very slowly, extended one claw and gently scratched the hatchling behind its ear. The purring intensified, the hatchling leaned into the touch, and for the first time since it had hatched, its body went completely still, not with fear, but with something that looked terrifyingly like trust. Kithra scratched behind its ear for an hour that night, and when she left, the hatchling did not flinch at her departure. It simply watched her go with those enormous silver eyes, and the last thing Kithra saw before she turned the corner was the faint glow of the gold veins in its scales, pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that was not quite a heartbeat. It was contentment, she was sure of it. She went to Valeth the next morning. The matriarch listened in silence as Kithra described everything: the hatching, the hatchling's appearance, its behavior, its refusal to eat, its fear, its gradual warming. When Kithra finished, Valeth was quiet for so long that the young dragon began to wonder if the elder had fallen asleep. "The thing in the outer caverns has hatched," Valeth said at last. It was not a question. "Yes, matriarch. And it is not a dragon's." Kithra hesitated. "It looks like a dragon, mostly. Its body structure is similar, it has wings, it has scales, but the scales are different, and its ears are different, and its teeth are different, and it doesn't eat, and it hums, and—" "It is not a dragon," Valeth repeated, and this time there was something in her voice that made Kithra fall silent. The old matriarch rose from her resting position, her massive body unfolding with the slow majesty of a mountain range coming awake, and turned her good eye toward Kithra. "Bring it to me." Kithra's stomach dropped. "Matriarch, I don't think it's terrified of everything, of every dragon. It took me 10 days just to get it to let me touch it. If I bring it here to the heart cavern with all the other elders and the noise and it will panic. It might hurt itself trying to get away. Then make it understand that it has nothing to fear." "You don't understand, it's not a rational fear. It's like the fear is built into it, like it was born afraid. Like being afraid is its default state and everything else is something it has to work toward." Valeth studied Kithra for a long moment. "You have bonded with it." The words were not accusatory, they were not even surprised. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered with the flat precision of a blade being drawn from a sheath. Kithra started and then stopped. There was no point in lying, not to Valeth. "Yes, I think I have." "Then you will bring it, and you will be responsible for its behavior. If it causes harm to any egg, any hatchling, any dragon in this creche, the bond will not save it. Do you understand?" Kithra understood, she understood completely. She spent the rest of the day preparing the hatchling, speaking to it softly, explaining what was going to happen, knowing full well that it probably couldn't understand a single word she was saying, but hoping that the tone, the intent, the care behind the words would communicate what the words themselves could not. That night she carried the hatchling to the heart cavern. It was, as she had predicted, a disaster. The hatchling panicked the moment they entered the main tunnel. Its body went rigid in Kithra's jaws, its wings flared, and it let out a sound that Kithra had never heard before, a high, keening wail that was not aggressive but was so filled with terror that every dragon within earshot turned to look. The sound bounced off the tunnel walls and amplified, echoing and re-echoing, until it seemed like the entire mountain was screaming. Kithra held on. She held on with everything she had, keeping her jaws gentle, keeping her grip firm but not crushing, murmuring reassurances around the hatchling's trembling body as it struggled and thrashed and made that terrible, heartbreaking sound. They made it to the heart cavern. The hatchling went limp in her jaws, not calm, not reassured, but playing dead, a prey animal response so instinctive and so wrong for anything with dragon blood that several of the elders recoiled in distaste. Valeth was waiting. She looked at the hatchling dangling from Kithra's jaws, limp, trembling, its silver eyes squeezed shut, its beautiful iridescent scales flat and dull with fear, and something passed across her ancient face. Something that Kithra had never seen before and could not name. "Put it down," Valeth said. Kithra lowered her head and gently released the hatchling onto the warm stone floor of the heart cavern. It hit the ground and immediately tried to burrow beneath Kithra's belly, pressing itself against her scales with a desperation that made Kithra's chest ache. "It will not look at me," Valeth observed. She lowered her massive head until her good eye was inches from the hatchling's trembling body. "Little one, I will not harm you." The hatchling made a sound that was barely audible, a tiny, broken chime, like a wind chime that had been shattered and was trying to ring one last time. Valith pulled back, her expression was unreadable. This creature is not a dragon, she said, addressing the gathered elders. Its body mimics ours, but its essence is something else entirely. I can feel it, there is no fire in it, no flame, no ember. Dragons are born of fire, we are fire made flesh. This one, she paused. This one is made of something else, something I do not recognize. A shapeshifter, suggested Elder Morath, his deep blue scales rasping as he shifted his weight. No, a shapeshifter would feel like what it was imitating, only false. This feels true but alien. It is genuinely what it appears to be, it simply is not what we are. Then what is it? Kithra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Valith looked at her, and for the first time, Kithra saw something in the old matriarch's eye that she never expected to see. Uncertainty. I do not know. The hatchling chose that moment to do something unexpected. It detached itself from Kithra's belly slowly, reluctantly, every muscle in its small body visibly fighting the movement, and took 3 steps toward Valith. Its eyes were still squeezed shut. Its body was still shaking so badly that its legs could barely support it. But it walked forward one agonizing step at a time until it was close enough to touch the matriarch's snout. Then it opened its eyes, looked directly into Valith's good eye, and hummed. It was the same low, soft purr hum that Kithra had heard in the outer caverns. But this time there was something different about it. The melody, if it could be called a melody, had a structure to it, a pattern. It rose and fell in specific intervals, and the gold veins in the hatchling's scales pulsed in sync with each rise and fall, and the air around the hatchling shimmered faintly, and Kithra felt something wash over her that she could only describe as comfort. Pure, undiluted, unconditional comfort. Like being wrapped in warmth. Like hearing a lullaby from a mother you had never known. Like being told in a language deeper than words that everything was going to be all right. Every dragon in the heart cavern felt it. She could see it in their faces, the sudden softening of ancient eyes, the easing of tense muscles, the slight tilt of heads as though they were listening to music that only they could hear. Even Elder Morath, who was as stoic and unyielding as the mountain stone, let out a slow breath that fogged in the warm air of the cavern. The hum lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the hatchling collapsed onto the stone floor, utterly exhausted, and did not move. Valith stared at it for a very long time. Kithra, she said finally, and her voice was strange, quieter than usual, as though she was afraid of disturbing something fragile. You will care for this one. You will not bring it into the communal areas again without my explicit permission. You will tell no one outside this chamber of what you have seen tonight. But matriarch, the other dragons, they need to know that this creature is not dangerous. The hum, you felt it, it's not. I felt it, Valith interrupted. That is precisely why they will not know, not yet. She turned her good eye away from the hatchling, and Kithra could have sworn she saw the old dragon's jaw tighten. Fear is a powerful thing, Kithra. It makes creatures do terrible things to what they do not understand. And what I do not understand, what none of us understand, is how a creature that small and that afraid can produce something that powerful. Kithra looked down at the hatchling. It had curled into a tight ball, its tail wrapped around its nose, its wings tucked close to its body. Even unconscious, it was trembling. I understand, matriarch, she said. She picked the hatchling up and carried it back to the outer caverns. It did not wake the entire way. 2 months passed. The hatchling grew, but slowly, far more slowly than any dragon hatchling would have. At 2 months, a dragon hatchling would be the size of a large dog, its scales hardening, its wings strengthening, its fire beginning to manifest as tiny puffs of smoke and the occasional accidental ember. The iridescent hatchling, which Kithra had taken to calling Lumen, because she needed to call it something and the name meant light that does not burn in the old dragon tongue, was barely larger than it had been at hatching. Its scales had grown more vibrant, if that was possible, the iridescence deepening until it seemed to contain every color that existed and several that shouldn't. Its wings had grown proportionally, remaining absurdly large for its body, giving it the look of a creature designed for flight but not yet ready to achieve it. It still would not eat solid food. Kithra had tried everything. Raw meat, cooked meat, fish, eggs, fruits, roots, mushrooms, honey, grain. The hatchling turned its nose up at all of it with a fastidious disdain that seemed almost comical coming from a creature so small and so afraid. It drank water, vast quantities of it, far more than any creature its size should need, and it basked in the warmth of the heat crystals, pressing its body against them with a languid contentment that made Kithra think of a cat in a sunbeam. And it hummed. Every night without fail, Lumen hummed. The melodies evolved, growing more complex, more layered, more beautiful. Sometimes the hum was so soft that Kithra had to press her snout against the hatchling's body to feel the vibration of it. Sometimes it filled the entire outer caverns with a resonance that made the stone walls sing in harmony. And always, always, the gold veins in Lumen's scales pulsed in time with the music, and the air around the hatchling shimmered, and Kithra felt that impossible comfort wash over her like a wave. She was not the only one who noticed the changes. The heat crystals in the outer caverns had begun to grow brighter. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention from the main tunnels, but noticeably. The dull, sparse crystals that Kithra remembered from her first furtive visits were now glowing with a warm, steady light that rivaled the crystals in the heart cavern. The stone walls of the cavern, which had been cold and damp and gray, had taken on a faint luster, as though the rock itself was being slowly, gently polished from within. The plants were the most startling change. There should not have been any plants in the outer caverns. It was too far from the entrance, too deep in the mountain, too dark and too cold for anything green to survive. But one morning, Kithra arrived to find a thin tendril of moss creeping along the edge of Lumen's nest, vibrant, impossibly green, growing in a spiral pattern that mirrored the shape of the gold veins in the hatchling's scales. Within a week, the moss had spread across the entire floor of the cavern. Within 2 weeks, small flowers had appeared, pale blue and silver, matching the colors in Lumen's eyes. Within a month, the outer caverns looked less like a barren cave and more like a garden growing in the heart of a mountain. Kithra did not understand what was happening, but she understood with a certainty that went beyond logic that Lumen was causing it. The hatchling's presence was not just tolerated by the mountain, it was welcomed, nourished. The stone and the crystals and the ancient, patient earth of Mount Serath were responding to this small, fearful creature as though it was something they had been waiting for. She went to Valeth again. The matriarch listened, then she was silent for a very long time. "There is a story," Valeth said at last, and her voice had the distant, dreaming quality of a dragon reaching back through centuries of memory. "A story from before the wars, before the human empires, before even the first clutch. It is the oldest story we have, so old that I do not know if it is history or myth or something in between." She settled deeper into her resting position, her copper scales catching the amber light of the crystals. In the beginning, when the world was new and the mountains were still growing, there were not two kinds of intelligent life but three. Dragons born of fire, humans born of earth, and a third, a people who had no name because they did not need one. They were born of the space between things, the pause between heartbeats, the silence between notes, the moment between lightning and thunder. They were not powerful, they were not numerous. They were not warriors or builders or conquerors. They were, Valeth paused, searching for a word. They were the feeling you get when you watch the sun rise over a mountain and your chest hurts because the world is so beautiful that your body cannot contain the response. They were that feeling given form. Kithra said nothing, she barely breathed. The old stories say that the third people, as the scholars later named them, could sing the world into change. Not with magic exactly. Magic was a tool, a technology, something you learned and controlled. What the third people did was something different, something older. They would hum and the mountains would listen. They would sing and the rivers would change course. They would weave melodies so beautiful that the stone itself would soften and reshape at their bidding. They did not dominate the world. They collaborated with it, they asked, and the world answered. "What happened to them?" Kithra whispered. Valeth's good eye dimmed. "We happened, humans happened. The wars came and the third people had no armies, no defenses, no way to fight back against creatures of fire and earth who wanted what they had. They did not run, they did not hide, they simply," Valeth's voice caught just for a moment on something that sounded painfully like grief. "They went quiet, one by one they stopped singing. And when they stopped singing, the world forgot them. Their cities crumbled into forests. Their songs dissolved into wind. Their names became sounds that meant nothing. And within a few generations, even the dragons and the humans who had driven them to silence forgot that they had ever existed." The silence that followed was so complete that Kithra could hear the blood moving through her own veins. "You think Lumen is," she couldn't finish the sentence. "I think," Valeth said slowly, "that an egg appeared in the most protected place in dragon territory, an egg that is not dragon-made, an egg that is beautiful in a way that dragons are not beautiful, and from that egg hatched a creature that hums and makes the mountain grow flowers. I think that the world has a very long memory, even when the people living on it do not. And I think that whatever force placed that egg in the heart cavern knew exactly what it was doing." "But Lumen is so afraid," Kithra said, and there was a break in her voice that she could not control. "Of everything, of everyone, it can barely function around other dragons. It took me 2 months just to get it to stop hiding when I enter the room. If it's truly one of the third people, if it's supposed to be able to sing the world into change, then why is it so broken?" Valeth looked at her, and the expression on the old dragon's face was one that Kithra had never seen before, complex, layered, holding both compassion and a sadness so deep that it seemed to have its own gravity. "Perhaps," Valeth said quietly, "it is not broken. Perhaps it is the opposite of broken. Perhaps it is so sensitive to the world, to every vibration, every emotion, every tiny shift in the fabric of reality that being alive is an overwhelming experience for it. Perhaps it feels everything all the time with an intensity that you and I cannot imagine. And perhaps fear is not its weakness. Perhaps fear is the only thing standing between it and a world that is too loud, too bright, too much for a creature that was built to feel." Kithra thought about that. She thought about the way Lumen flinched at sudden sounds, the way it pressed itself against walls as though trying to minimize the amount of world it had to interact with, the way its hum was always soft, always controlled, always careful, as though it was holding back something enormous for fear of what would happen if it let go. She thought about the comfort she felt when Lumen hummed, that warm, all-encompassing, unconditional comfort that felt like being loved by the universe itself. If that was what Lumen produced when it was holding back, what would happen if it ever let go? The thought terrified her, and it filled her with a fierce, protective love that she felt in every scale of her body. "He's mine," she said, and the words came out harder and more certain than she had intended. "He's mine, and I will not let anyone, dragon, human, or anything else, use him or hurt him or take him. Do you understand, matriarch?" Valeth's mouth curved. It was not quite a smile. Dragons did not smile, but it was the closest thing to one that Kithra had ever seen on the old dragon's face. "I understand," Valeth said. "He is lucky to have you, Kithra, and we are lucky that he does." The human came 3 months after Lumen hatched. Kithra smelled him before she saw him, a sharp, acrid scent that she recognized with immediate and visceral revulsion. Human, the smell of their fires, their metal, their skin. The smell of the creatures who had driven the third people to silence, who had warred against dragonkind for centuries, who had pushed both species to the edge of extinction before a fragile, begrudging peace had been established. She was in the outer caverns with Lumen when the scent reached her. The hatchling was draped across her foreleg, basking in the warmth of her scales, humming softly in that drowsy, half-asleep way that always made the flowers in the cavern bloom a little brighter. At the first hint of human smell, Kithra's body went rigid. Lumen felt the change. His hum stopped. His silver eyes opened, wide and alert, and he lifted his head and looked toward the tunnel that connected the outer caverns to the main passages. He could smell it too. But his reaction was not what Kithra expected. There was no fear in his eyes, no panic, no desperate scramble for the safety of a wall or a hiding place. Instead, his head tilted to one side, that characteristic undragon-like tilt, and his ears swiveled forward, and something that Kithra had never seen before appeared on his delicate, iridescent face. Curiosity, pure, undiluted, fearless curiosity. "Lumen, no," Kithra said, wrapping her tail around him. "Stay here, do not move." She rose and moved toward the tunnel entrance, her body low, her scales flaring with the threat display that dragons use to intimidate rivals. If a human had somehow found their way into the creche, through the upward-falling waterfall, past the ward magic, through miles of tunnels that should have been impassable to anything without wings and thermal vision, then something had gone terribly wrong, and she needed to. She reached the tunnel and stopped. A human was standing at the far end of the passage. A single human, smaller than most humans, though Kithra's knowledge of human sizes was limited and mostly based on centuries-old accounts from the wars. Female, she thought, based on the shape of the body and the length of the dark hair that fell in tangled waves around a narrow, weathered face. The human was wearing clothing that was heavily worn, a thick coat of some kind, mended in a dozen places, stained with dirt and what might have been old blood. Boots that had been resoled so many times that they were more patched than original material. A pack on its back that looked like it contained everything the human owned in the world. The human was also standing completely still, with its hands raised to shoulder height, palms open and empty, a gesture of surrender, of harmlessness, of peace. And it was looking at Kithra with an expression that she did not know how to process. The human was not afraid. It should have been afraid. A dragon, a full-grown dragon, even a young one like Kithra, was the most dangerous predator on the planet. Humans feared dragons with a deep, instinctual terror that had been bred into them over generations of war. This human should have been shaking, or screaming, or running, or all three. Instead, it was looking at Kithra with an expression of patient, quiet calm that was almost respectful. "I know you can understand me," the human said. Its voice was low and rough, as though it had not been used in a long time. The words were in the human tongue, which Kithra understood. All dragons of sufficient age learned human languages, a necessity of the uneasy peace that existed between the species. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I need help, and I hope that you might be willing to give it." Kithra did not move. Her fire was building in her chest, a low, contained heat that she could release in a single devastating burst if the human made any hostile move. "How did you get here?" she asked, and her voice echoed in the tunnel like rolling stone. The human flinched not at the sound but at the reality of a dragon speaking to it, then it steadied. "I walked through the waterfall, through the tunnels. It took me 6 days, the wards let me through." It paused, and something flickered across its face, something that might have been confusion or wonder or both. "They didn't even slow me down. I thought there would be, I don't know, a barrier, a test, something, but I just walked through and the magic just moved aside like it wanted me to pass." Kithra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the tunnel. The wards have never let a human through, she said. In 1,000 years, no human has ever passed the waterfall. The human shrugged a small, tired gesture. Then maybe they were waiting for the right one or the right reason. It lowered its hands slowly, carefully, keeping them visible. My name is Alara, I'm a healer, I came because it stopped, swallowed. And for the first time the calm cracked and Kithra saw beneath it a depth of exhaustion and desperation that was staggering in its intensity. I came because I've been dreaming about this place, Alara said. For 3 months every night. The same dream, the warm tunnels, the glowing crystals, the dark egg with the gold veins. I've never been here, I didn't even know this place existed. But I dreamed it night after night and every morning I woke up knowing that something was waiting for me here. Something that needed me. Behind Kithra in the outer caverns, Lumen made a sound. It was not a hum. It was not the warbling question note from the night of his hatching. It was something new, a clear, ringing tone that cut through the air like a bell, and the gold veins in the cavern walls, the ones that Kithra had barely noticed, so subtle were they, so easily mistaken for mineral deposits, flared to life. The entire outer caverns blazed with golden light, and the tunnel filled with a warmth that was not dragon fire but something else entirely. Something that smelled like rain on dry earth and new growth and the first breath of spring. Alara's eyes widened, not with fear, with recognition. That sound, she whispered. I've heard that sound in my dreams every single night. Kithra turned her head and looked back into the outer caverns. Lumen had unwrapped himself from her tail and was standing at the entrance to the tunnel, his tiny body trembling but not with fear. His silver eyes were fixed on the human with an intensity that Kithra had never seen in him before, and the gold veins in his scales were pulsing so fast and so bright that he looked like a living constellation. And then, with the same cautious, deliberate steps that he had used to approach Kithra on that first night in the nest, Lumen walked past her. He walked past a dragon, a creature that he had spent 2 months learning to trust, that he still flinched around if she moved too fast, and he walked toward a human that he had never seen before. He walked toward Alara's. Kithra's breath caught. She did not try to stop him. She did not know how to explain what she was feeling, a strange, painful, beautiful certainty that something was happening that was meant to happen, that had always been meant to happen, that the universe had been quietly arranging for longer than anyone could measure. Lumen reached Alara and stopped. He looked up at her, this tiny, trembling, iridescent creature looking up at a human who was 100 times his size, and his silver eyes met her brown ones. Alara knelt. She knelt slowly, carefully, the way you would kneel before something sacred. And as she lowered herself to the ground, her face came closer to Lumen's, and Kithra saw something happen that she would remember for the rest of her life. Lumen reached out and touched Alara's face with his snout. And he sang. Not hummed, not the soft, controlled purr melodies that Kithra had come to know. This was a song, a real song, with layers and harmonics and a complexity that surpassed anything Kithra had ever heard. It was the sound of mountains being born, of rivers finding their paths, of seeds breaking open in dark soil and reaching for light they had never seen. It was the sound of the world being made, and unmade and made again, and every note of it was beautiful beyond the capacity of dragon or human language to describe. The gold veins in the walls blazed. The flowers in the outer caverns erupted into bloom, not the small, delicate flowers that had been growing before, but massive, extravagant blossoms that filled the cavern with color and scent. The heat crystals blazed so bright that the tunnel was flooded with light. And Kithra felt the comfort wash over her again, stronger this time, so strong that her knees buckled and she had to brace herself against the wall, and she understood in that moment what Valeth had been trying to tell her. This was what Lumen sounded like when he wasn't holding back. This was what the third people had been capable of. And this was why they had been feared. Because no creature of fire or earth could withstand this. No wall could stand against it. No weapon could deflect it. It was not a weapon, it was the opposite of a weapon. It was the power to make the world want to cooperate with you, to make stones soften and water change course and flowers grow in the dark, to make every living thing within earshot feel with absolute and undeniable certainty that they were loved. It was the most powerful thing Kithra had ever experienced, and it was coming from a hatchling the size of a housecat who was afraid of his own shadow. The song ended. Lumen slumped against Alara's knee, exhausted, his scales dimming, his breathing ragged. The light in the walls faded to a gentle glow. The flowers remained, they did not disappear, but the explosive force of their blooming settled into a quiet, sustained beauty. Alara was crying. Silent tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dirt and exhaustion, and she was looking down at Lumen with an expression of such raw, overwhelming tenderness that Kithra had to look away. There you are, Alara whispered. Her voice broke on the words. I've been looking for you. I didn't know it was you I was looking for, but I've been looking my whole life. Lumen looked up at her, and his silver eyes, those enormous, too large liquid silver eyes, were calm. Not afraid, not for the first time since hatching, not cautious, not controlled, not holding back. Just calm. As though he had finally, after 3 months of terror and isolation and gradual, painful trust, found the one thing in the world that he did not need to be afraid of. He pressed his face into Alara's palm and closed his eyes. And he purred. Kithra stood in the tunnel and watched a human and a dragon hatchling that was not a dragon hold each other in the heart of a mountain. And she felt something shift inside her, something that felt like the world rearranging itself to make room for a truth that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. Humans had driven the third people to silence. But a human had found the last one. And the last one was not afraid of her. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that had always been the point. Not revenge, not justice, not the settling of ancient debts, but reconciliation. The simplest, most difficult thing in the world. A human kneeling in the dark and a creature made of music and light and fear choosing to trust her. Kithra turned and walked back into the outer caverns, stepping carefully over the carpet of flowers that now covered the floor. She lay down in her usual spot, curled her tail around the heat crystal that still sat beside the nest where Lumen had hatched, and rested her chin on her forelegs. She would need to tell Valeth. There would be discussions and arguments and probably a great deal of old dragon anxiety about the implications of a human living in the Creche of Veils. There would be politics and fear and the slow, grinding machinery of two species trying to figure out how to share a world that neither of them owned. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, there was a small, beautiful creature that was not afraid for the first time in its life, and the human it had chosen, and a mountain full of flowers that should not have existed but did anyway, because the world wanted them to. And Kithra, young, impulsive, bonds too quickly Kithra, who had broken the rules for an egg that wasn't even dragon, closed her eyes and listened to Lumen purr, and felt the warmth of the heat crystal against her scales, and thought that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth breaking every rule for. Outside, far above the Creche of Veils, far above the waterfall that fell upward and the ward magic that had let one human pass after 1,000 years of refusal, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient orbits. And if anyone had been watching closely, very closely, with eyes that could see the invisible threads that connected all living things, they might have noticed that those threads were humming. A low, soft, gentle hum. The sound of something that had been silent for a very long time, finally finding its voice again. And in the heart of the mountain, a human held a dragon that was not a dragon, and the world exhaled.